You guys know House, right? It's one of those Japanese films that only really became known in the West during the early period of the internet, where it became kind of an early meme due to its surrealistic scenes. And it's really great material for that kind of thing, because, I mean, just look at these images on screen. But as time has gone by, it's become viewed as more than just an oddity. More and more of its director, Nobuhiko Obayashi's work has been translated. It's become clear that House is very representative of his style, which is dominated by this intentional artificiality and playful surrealism. Over the past few months, I decided to watch every Obayashi movie I could find, and it was a banger. Of the 26 films I watched, only one was outright bad, and there's quite a few I'd call masterpieces. So I'm going to go through each one I watched. Just a disclaimer to start with, there are a few translated Obayashi movies I just couldn't find. Also, I pretty much got these where I could, so some of the footage will vary in quality. Anyway, without further ado.
1966.
Emotion.
At an age where feeling ends, I was creating a television commercial, but I was making this film too. And this is also the story of those who made this film.
So in the 1960s, Obayashi directed a bunch of commercials and also short films, including this one, which is usually seen as his best work from the period. This movie kind of feels like a collection of things young Obayashi thought were cool. Vampires, French New Wave style techniques, lesbians. It's very clearly a no-budget, non-studio film, but it's very fun and expressive for what it is. It's also got this really nice narration that bookends the piece.
Well, it's all over. Now we might think about it.
The Visitor in the Eye.
So this is an adaptation of a chapter from the manga Blackjack, which is by Osamu Tezuka, an extremely important figure in Japanese pop culture. Tezuka also seems like he was a pretty important figure to Obayashi. There's even a discussion about the significance of his work in one of Obayashi's final films. Blackjack himself is this fictional surgeon who investigates outlandish illnesses. I'm not going to spend too much time on this movie here because I actually have another video I'm working on specifically on Tezuka adaptations, but I'll just say quickly, I loved this movie. I think it's a visually sumptuous and charming tribute to the Blackjack character, and structurally it has this really fun whodunit style. But I know I'm kind of in the minority on this one. I see it listed as a weaker entry quite a lot. That might mean that this is an adaptation where some familiarity of the source text is required to really get a lot out of it. I would hope that's not the case. I would have thought the music and visuals alone would be enough to appreciate this, but that's the picture I've been getting from other people's reviews. For me though, no doubt about it, this is high tier Obayashi. And as with basically all of his stuff, especially from the 70s, just an excellent soundtrack.
Like the fires in the night, love illumines feelings. What is wrong, what is right will show itself and you'll see. Take fear away from here, it will blind a vision. Please stay alive today, it's all in your decision.
One complaint though. Blackjack is played by Joe Shishido, who I think gives a good performance, but he doesn't have quite the physical look for the role. I actually think this guy, Tori Minagishi, who plays the film's villain, might have been a better choice for that casting. Worth noting too, this is actually Minagishi's first appearance in an Obayashi movie, and he'll be in almost every one going forward. I think Obayashi liked him because he has the looks of a classic Hollywood-era leading man. Anyway, yeah, I love this one. I wouldn't quite say it's my favourite of the list, but I would say it probably has my favourite scene in all of his filmography. This moment in which Minagishi plays the piano while imagining his dead lover, and the music totally overtakes the film. It's an example of the kind of melodrama that Obayashi is just perfect at.
Take me away.
Obayashi's
second
film after Hausu feels like an attempt to show that he can do a quote-unquote normal movie. Narratively, it's a very standard rom-com, partially set in San Francisco. The screenplay is remarkably bad, and there's really nothing to hold on to there. Two Japanese people meet in America, the woman is like a piano tuner or something, and the guy decides he doesn't want to be with her anymore, and he pretends he's like being hunted by the mafia to get her to go away. And so she goes away, and then there's like half an hour of her pining after him, and then she learns he lied to get rid of her and gets mad, and then she gets married to this other dude, and then suddenly the first dude decides he's into her again. I don't know, this is just a complete granola bar of a movie narratively. And the love interest guy is really off-putting and horrible in this narrative. No, girl. No. Anyway, the screenplay kind of falls apart at the end, and there's a big pie fight for some reason, but that was actually kind of fun. This movie is like the definition of mid, and yet I still found myself kind of enjoying it. It's fun to see Obayashi play around in San Francisco, and he still puts in quite a bit of his visual flair. Definitely lower tier stuff though.
The School in the Crosshairs.
Aside from Hausu, this is probably the most purely fun Obayashi, and I fucking loved it. Like another of his big movies from this period, it's an adaptation of a young adult sci-fi novel. This one about these space espers who take over a school as part of a covert invasion of Earth. It's clearly meant to be read as a metaphor for encroaching fascism and the rise of totalitarianism, but I'll be honest, I was all in this for the aesthetics. This movie to me kind of encapsulates the vibe of early Obayashi. Cartoony visuals, music that wouldn't feel out of place in an anime, and multimedia special effects that are designed to be inventive but not realistic. There's an emphasis in these films on unreality, like this scene in a car where the rear projection isn't disguised but heightened, or the special effects which were very clearly a mix of animation and live action. It's complemented by a colour palette and cartoonish sense of physics, which more than anything reminded me of tokusatsu from the time. For whatever reason, Japanese pop culture in the 80s was really fixated on psychic abilities, and this ends with this explosion of imagery as the main characters have a psychic musical battle. I'll be honest, I didn't totally follow the plot, partially because the subs weren't perfect, and partially because, as we'll see, Obayashi often struggles to get across the sci-fi minutiae when he's adapting these sort of stories. But in this case, I didn't care. It's totally swept up in the style and energy and the emotions of this movie. It's not quite my favourite Obayashi, but definitely in my top 5, and in my opinion, easily the most consistently enjoyable to watch. Also, why is there a monkey in this movie?
Kawaii Devil.
So this is the first of 2 horror movies he did for a TV movie night called Tuesday Night Suspense. Hats off to him, aside from the TV show logo bumpers, you wouldn't know this was made for television. With TV movies, I usually expect a more restrained, less auteurist style, but this has Obayashi all over it. The music is this constant blare of classical pieces. Shout out to everyone's favourite Evangelion track, Pachelbel Canon. Visually, it's got that 70s horror look down, very creepy Japanese rural environment, with a colour palette that is mostly drab, but with these sudden shocks of colour. Aesthetically, it reminds me of Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now. Honestly, something about the way cheap film stock looked in the 70s and 80s just massively worked for horror films. Movies just looked creepier with that washed out look. The story is similar to The Omen or Bad Seed, murderous child on the loose. Of all the Obayashi horror movies, I'd say this is the one that's most actually scary. Consequently, this isn't really for me as someone who's a wimp and not really a horror fan, but I can still see why it's a really great piece of work.
The Girl Who Conquered Time.
So this is another adaptation of a young adult sci-fi novel. This one about a teenage girl who mysteriously finds herself moving back in time. This is one of Obayashi's idol works, a series of movies he made, each as a vehicle for a pop star to transition into acting. In this case, the pop star is Tomoyo Harada. I was pretty hard on this movie the first time I saw it. I don't think it helped that I'm a big fan of the Hosoda adaptation of the same novel from 2006. And while this one might be more faithful to the original text, I just found it a lot less effective as a film. The Hosoda anime develops its time travel conceit way quicker, and then finds all sorts of relatable and visually inventive ways to explore that concept. This movie is a much slower burn, and the time travel element really only comes into focus about 50 minutes in, at which point it's almost halfway done. It also has a problem that I find with a lot of Obayashi's sci-fi adaptations, which is that the mechanics of the plot become overly complicated and really poorly explained. Having seen the Hosoda version, I pretty much got what was happening, but Obayashi's film also has these elements of mind control and false memories that are just really poorly explained. The central time travel conceit is also very hazily defined in this version. I was never really sure if our protagonist had any ability to manipulate the time travel process or not, which seems like a pretty important plot element. It probably doesn't help that I also really love the host of the film's much more tomboyish, roguish main character. Don't get me wrong, Tomoyo Harada is really good in this movie, but her character is just very reserved and introverted in a way I don't find very appealing. So yeah, not a perfectly constructed movie, but I actually don't want to be too negative about it here, because as time has gone by, those issues are way less fresh in my memory, and what's remained is how gorgeous the aesthetic is. Even among Obayashi's consistently beautiful films, there's something singular about this movie. It's one of those films that seems to exist in its own hazy aesthetic space, in this case filled with early morning blues and this melancholy steeliness that I think captures a certain feeling in adolescence. It's really grown on me, and while I don't relate to it in the same way as I do the Hosoda film, and I also don't think it's as structurally sound, I do appreciate what a worthy aesthetic piece it is in its own terms. Also, I can't not mention the end credits, in which Harada sings a key song during various scenes in the movie, and it's just incredibly aesthetic.
Legend of the Cat Monster.
This is the other Tuesday night suspense movie that Obayashi did. This one is aesthetically more televisual, but it has a really ambitious setting that I was very impressed by. So the premise of this movie is that it imagines that in the early half of the 20th century, the entire Japanese filmmaking industry was produced in one island city. A kind of Japanese island Hollywood. That is such a grandiose concept for what ends up being just a little ghost story about this vengeful spirit of a golden age actress. Stylistically, this is less manic than usual Obayashi. The camera doesn't move as much, there isn't as much of the multimedia stuff, but I think that's because way more of this is focused on portraying that island setting. So you get a lot of static compositions, but the frame is just filled of all these details to sell you on the concept of this island community. I think for such an interesting concept, it's not explored that much, but there are some really cool uses of it. Like, there's this one character who was born on the island, and she's never left. So she's basically grown up surrounded by this simulation of an outside world she's never experienced. Really cool stuff. At the end, it becomes kind of a standard slasher movie, and that's where it lost me. It just felt like a much less interesting version of what Obayashi had already done in Hausu. Even that had a few good things, though. Like, check out this cat scare. Good stuff. Of these two TV movies, I actually liked this one more. Again, that might be because I'm a baby and I don't like when horror is actually scary, but I do also think it's just so cool to see this level of world building and setting exploration in a small TV horror movie thing.
Kenya Boy.
I was excited about this one because it's Obayashi's only full anime. His 80s stuff feels like anime anyway, and there is some animation in his work, so I thought it'd be a good fit. Unfortunately, this movie fucking blows. It's a collection of a bunch of colonialist cliches with no self-reflection and a lot of unexciting chase scenes. Oof. Some of the animation is interesting though, particularly these pastoral scenes where Obayashi gets weird with it. A lot of the character animation is weirdly stiff though. Yeah.
The island closest to heaven.
So listen, I love summer hangout movies, and this movie is gorgeous. It takes place on the island of New Caledonia, and Obayashi lets the direction hang back. There's not as much fast cutting or showy style, mostly long fades and big vistas, letting us experience just how beautiful this island is. And honestly, it is beautiful. Why do so many movies take place in like London and New York when places like this exist? Unfortunately, this movie just isn't it. It's got some great actors, it's another Tomoyo Harada piece, and she's charming and relatable again, but emotionally, I found this movie so cloying. It's simultaneously broad and sentimental, while being really polite and distant. And it starts as kind of a breezy travel log, and I was up for that, but by the end, it pivots into a series of romance plot threads, which don't really go anywhere beyond a bunch of characters beaming at each other and smiling and nodding, while describing how much they've grown for their experience, and how they'll never forget one another. Puke. It kept me massively at a distance, and I just couldn't hook into the emotional energy this thing was putting up. A shame, because I was really down for some Boku no Natsuyami style summer vibes. But yeah, I just found this movie pretty aggravating.
Miss Lonely.
Another of Obayashi's idol movies. In this one, a teenage boy, in line to take over his father's Buddhist temple, begins to be haunted by a strange ghost girl. She's played by this extremely charismatic idol, Yasuko Tomita, who, like in The Girl Who Conquered Time, sings the end credits too. Anyway, most of this movie is just composed of this ghost girl trolling this guy, which, pretty fun to watch. Good stuff, can't complain. It ends up being a story about lost loves, and though it mostly has a pretty breezy tone, it builds to a surprisingly subtle and layered conclusion. For the most part though, this is just cute and fun 80s teen comedy stuff. Also, there's a joke about the main characters accidentally teaching a parrot a song about tanuki testicles, and this guy keeps doing backflips. You can't go wrong with this.
Four Sisters.
It's about four sisters, and there's a love triangle, and one of them has a baby. I don't know, I wasn't into this one. Some moments of brilliance at the beginning, but by the end it's just kind of a mid-weepy melodrama. Nice fashion though. Look at this jacket situation. Great jackets in this period of Obayashi.
His Motorbike, Her Island.
Pretty much one of the most aesthetic movies I've ever seen. It's not got a very complicated story. It's basically about a biker who spends some time on a small island and meets a girl who he introduces to motorbikes. Turns out she's even better than he is. Lots of very stylish montages ensue, and it's a good time. I know for some people this is top tier Obayashi. It's not quite there for me for some reason. I don't know why, I just didn't hook into it in that way. But it is very good stuff.
April Fish.
So, this is his take on a Billy Wilder style classic comedy. As a result, it's a very different visual style than usual. The camera is way more static than most of his work, but with very complex blocking and movements between the characters. You know, like an old 1940s Hollywood comedy. This movie is kind of a mixed bag for me, so let's start with the good. Aesthetically, this looks so pristine. If you like that city pop Japanese 80s look, oh boy is this the movie for you. I love this mint green hue over the whole thing, and in general, it kind of embodies what I imagine when I think of Japan during the bubble years. Expansive, sleek, and well designed. Very stylish outfits too, some of which wouldn't look too out of place in like Cyberpunk 2049. I'm extremely jealous of the main character's jacket, by the way, just look at this. Also, he's played by Yukihiro Takahashi, the lead vocalist of the band Yellow Submarine Orchestra. He's incredibly stylish and good looking in this movie, and also a pretty good actor. He also composed the music and produced this movie, so I think he had quite a big hand in it in general. Okay, so now the bad. So this thing is meant to be a comedy of errors, where the humour arises from misunderstandings piled upon misunderstandings. You know, like your standard Oscar Wilde play, or even an episode of Seinfeld. Within that genre, the screenplay is obviously extremely important. The situation has to feel relatable enough, while navigating plausibility and absurdity. Unfortunately, April Fish's screenplay completely falls apart in the middle act, with characters acting irrationally, or simply refusing to explain the situations and misunderstandings at play. Our main man, Takahashi, basically becomes mute when the shit starts going down, for no other reason than if he explained the situation, the drama would be easily resolved. It just feels really contrived and strained in a way these kind of films shouldn't. So yeah, this movie is a weird one. I would recommend it if you like that 80s city pop style, because it is just a treasure trove of aesthetic moments. And I would even say the first act and the last 10 minutes work okay as a comedy of errors. It's just like the middle, where the brunt of the drama goes down, is where this thing kind of falls apart. So yeah, I don't know, an interesting curiosity. I have some affection for it, but I can't recommend it wholeheartedly.
The Drifting Classroom.
So this is an adaptation of a manga that I'm a big fan of, about a school that is transported to a hellish netherworld. For some reason, this movie decides to set the action in an international school, with much of the dialogue in English, though it seems many of the actors are not fluent. This is the first Obayashi movie I genuinely did not like. The difficulty in understanding the characters makes this very hard to connect to. Also, the clear language barrier creates this sense that everyone is kind of shouting past each other and not really connecting.
Sumner, we finally got the group upstairs to calm down. Well, everybody famished.
Famished?
You know, kids, at times like this, food's the best pacifier. What do you think?
Makes sense to me.
Food!
And I don't even feel that all these performances are even necessarily bad. Some of them clearly get the cartoony vibe this movie is going for, and they're pitching their performances to that style.
You have sand on your lips, Ayumi. My big game is gone. Everything's buried deep in the sand.
We're going down those stairs as fat as I am.
It's just that no one in this movie is really connecting with the other actors. They're just kind of loudly proclaiming their lines. It doesn't help that the sound mix is awful, with the English dialogue often being basically inaudible beneath the soundtrack and Foley. Also, tonally, this is actually really different from the manga. The manga is deadpan, where most of the appeal comes from seeing grade schoolers having to take on adult responsibilities and essentially form a post-apocalyptic government. This movie, on the other hand, seems to be going for whimsy, mostly. It's much more dreamlike and chaotic, less concerned with the nuts and bolts of how this society is going to be run, and more with monsters and weird set pieces. And that's an absolutely fine choice to make, but this is the first time where, without any kind of narrative thread for me to hook into, I found the Obayashi dreamlike stuff just irritating and alienating, rather than exciting or frenetic.
The Discarnates.
A recently divorced TV writer discovers a nostalgic netherworld, where he can spend time with the spirits of his deceased parents. Unfortunately, spending time in the land of the dead is also slowly turning him into a rotting zombie. This is a beautifully nostalgic and gentle film that also occasionally becomes a gory giallo-style horror. Only Obayashi could do it. It's also the first appearance of Tsuruato Kataoka in an Obayashi film. He's got this working class, amiable vibe, and he'll go on to be a staple in his films.
Beijing watermelon.
Damn. Based on a true story, this is about a working class owner of a small grocery store, Bengal, who finds his workplace becoming a hangout for young Chinese immigrants studying in Japan. He's initially resistant to these students, but he eventually comes to act as a paternal figure to them. Stylistically, it's a complete 180 from Obayashi's usual work, more akin to Ozu. Aside from occasional bursts of classical pieces, there's no music, and the camera is completely static. Several scenes will just be an unbroken shot of the characters at a bar that will last for several minutes, with multiple friendly and aimless conversations overlapping and drifting in and out. It's honestly a remarkable piece of social realism, and it seems to show that if he'd wanted to, Obayashi probably could have made a whole career out of this kind of cinema. He just chose not to, I guess. It's also a surprisingly complex story. It's unclear exactly why our main character is doing this for his students. It's suggested that it could be because he finds purpose in it, but it also might be that he feels guilt due to his father's actions in the war. And his actions in helping the students are at times drastic. The store goes into debt as a result of him financially supporting them. So yeah, it's like a surprisingly complex character piece. In the last 30 minutes, Obayashi can't help himself, and the film slightly breaks away from its social realist style and becomes metatextual. They travel to China, but the crew weren't able to go because of the events of Tiananmen Square. And we have the actors outright admit this to the camera. We then see the filming process, and at the end, the real-life students who Bengal helped sing together. I'll admit, I teared up. It's a really great movie. Very unlike Obayashi's other work, which I think makes it even more impressive.
Cheeseko's younger sister.
I've been watching a lot of Sailor Moon recently and really enjoying that girly 90s shoujo aesthetic. If you like that look, Cheeseko's younger sister is an absolute banger. It's a drama about a Japanese schoolgirl coming to terms with the death of her older sister, who comes back as a ghost to kind of help her through high school. It's a pretty intense mix of fluffy high school drama with some real trauma, which I guess is a pretty good approximation of what growing up is like. One thing I kept thinking about watching this is how good Obayashi is at using music in his work. There's this one sequence here that uses Ode to Joy so amazingly. Like, check out this transition. And then the scene climaxes in this explosion of light and sound. It's just, this is so Obayashi. But he also knows how and when to use silence. Slight spoilers, but there's this horrifying scene in this movie, one of the most awkward I've ever watched. So the main character's father has been having an affair, and she has to sit and watch as her mum pleads with her husband's girlfriend not to continue seeing him. How does Obayashi decide to illustrate this scene? In one unbroken take with no music, just halting, horrifically awkward dialogue. And this scene, it lasts 7 minutes. 7 minutes. It's grueling, masterfully done, and horrifyingly awkward. You just feel the intense shame of sitting in that room.
The Rocking Horseman.
This is a very fun and well-crafted ode to boomer rock music. It's about growing up in 1960s Japan, being exposed to Western rock, and forming a band. I'll be honest and say that I have trouble with a lot of these biographical movies by boomers who grew up in the 60s and 70s, because While I like some of the music from that period, the hallowed tones this generation tends to describe their cultural artifacts in is kind of alien and off-putting to me. Like, I get it, yada yada counterculture, yada yada no one had heard anything like this before, yada yada no one else was growing their hair long. But I wasn't there, and for some reason I always find movies about this period harder to relate to than I should. Oh well, I'm sure it's just as alienating to some people when I talk about how much I love black dresses or Pat the Bunny. But yeah, don't let me be a cynic and put you off, because even I have to admit this is really high tier Obayashi. It's also, I think, kind of archetypical 90s Obayashi. What I mean by that is it's got a more realist setting, but you still get his penchant for experimentalism. It's just that tends to come more through dream sequences, or kind of the imagination of the characters being visualized on screen. That's kind of how these sort of 90s films tend to more operate. Also, this isn't a very, Le Cinema comparison, but what this really reminded me of at times was Malcolm in the Middle. It has similar cutaways. And despite this being basically a slice of life growing up story, this is visually really ambitious, with fluid and mobile camera work, and some pretty great images all around. Musically it's great too, but I hope you enjoy hearing this guitar riff, because it's played endlessly in this movie. But yeah, clearly a very important film to Obayashi, and if you have any kind of attachment to this period of music, you should seek it out. Personally though, when it comes to these kind of nostalgic Japanese music dramas, I still prefer K-On! Sorry.
Samurai Kids.
A young kid discovers a crusty miniature samurai dude who lives in rivers. I don't know, this one didn't do a lot for me. It's kind of a Spielbergian kids movie. Some very impressive compositing, really does show that the weird artificial green screen style in Obayashi's work is an intentional choice, because when he wanted to, he could pull off believable effects too. But yeah, I'm not the target audience for this. I don't know, I like the bit where the samurai plays Super Nintendo, I guess.
Sada.
A movie about the real-life Sadie Abe, the timeless story of a woman who cut off her partner's, you know. Any adaptation of the Sadie Abe story is going to be in dialogue with the film of her life that is most famous, the one by Nagisa Oshima in the 70s, In the Realm of the Senses. That's a tentpole of Japanese cinema. It's a movie which, as far as I can tell, positions her actions as a result of a national trauma, a manifestation of distress during the increasing militarization of the nation state. It's also, at least in my opinion, kind of a bummer to watch. It's just a very cold movie with this faded out color scheme, and it's shot in really long, dreary masters. I find it very numbing. Stylistically, this movie is as far as we can get from that realism. Obayashi does everything you'd expect to let us in on Sadie's perspective, and it's always clear that this is a movie about how she saw the world subjectively. There's lots of cartoonish physics, interesting lighting, and a few times it becomes a musical. It's a good movie aesthetically, but to be honest, I haven't found either version of Sadie Abe's story as engaging as I should have. The most interesting part of this to me is seeing how the Japanese public reacted to her, how she became a romantic folk hero. I think that's what I'd like to see a movie about, more than the act itself. Okay, so as we get to the 2000s films, I want to take a break to generally talk about some of the changes in style going forward, because really, late period Obayashi is kind of his own beast entirely. If there was a slight move towards realism in Obayashi's career in the late 80s and 90s, a more grounded aesthetic, then the 2000s saw a re-embrace in his films of artificiality. Like the fluid dreamscapes that ended films like School in the Crosshairs and Hausu, his 2000s films would return to a chaotic multimedia approach. But whereas in those earlier films, these were largely explosions at the climax, now they dominated the entire work. Green screen is used pretty much throughout these movies, and there's no attempt to hide it. The perspectives shift uneasily as characters move around clearly artificial spaces. Both the characters and the background seem to be in a constant state of movement in these films, which is sometimes overwhelming. And this is compounded by Obayashi basically saying fuck it to all filmic grammar. There's a total disregard for eyeline matches, for the 180-degree rule, and sometimes for even having a consistent physical space. If this isn't overwhelming enough, Obayashi will also cut between different time zones and physical locations rapidly, often with characters somehow seeming to be in a constant time slip, communicating across decades or even centuries. And the dialogue is an overwhelming barrage. It's just endless in these movies, and also dense. Characters have weighty conversations filled with historical anecdotes and complicated disagreements about history, about philosophy, and about aesthetics. And then you combine this with a re-embrace of different visual forms. In a conversation about the atomic bomb, we'll cut to a crude CG representation of the different A-bombs used. And pop culture is also present. An already very complex conversation about Japan's relationship to nuclear energy will then simultaneously become a conversation about the imagery of Osamu Tezuka's sci-fi manga. And sometimes it feels as if there's no silence in these films, like every second is taken up both by a very present musical score and also overlapping dense dialogue. It's as if Obayashi, worried he was running out of time, wanted to make sure that every moment in his last films were about 2 or 3 things at once, making sure that he could say as much as humanly possible, communicate everything he possibly could in his final years. The result is completely and utterly overwhelming. On Letterboxd, I flippantly described the aesthetic as a mix between Metal Gear Solid cutscenes, J-drama, and the third impact scene from End of Evangelion. At times, it creates images that look a little like a late 90s PC adventure game. At times, it looks ugly, and at times, it looks kind of brilliant. And what these films really feel like to me is a result of an older director completely liberated by modern editing software. His film Casting Blossoms to the Sky opens not with the usual A Movie title card, which all of his films up to that point had began with, but with a movie essay title card. And it is more of a video essay than a traditional narrative. It has a narrative, but it's more of a stream of different conversations, exploring topics around war. And during these conversations, he'll often interject images, for instance, of the real-life historical figures being referenced. I think that Obayashi was really excited to finally have so few barriers between himself and his vision. And it's not just an aesthetic change either. These films are extremely overtly political. And in a way, that is kind of surprising. It's not that his films were ever without politics, but he was never seen as overtly radical as leftist filmmakers like Nagisa Oshima or Jean-Luc Godard. And yet these last films are inextricable from politics, and they're angry. They're fixated on Japan's descent into nationalism before and during World War II, on the abuse of Korean labor leading up to the war, on the historical atrocity of so-called comfort women, and on Japan's fascination with American culture during the occupation. History is extremely present and important to these films. Conversations will dovetail into flashes backwards in time, usually to the war, but also often even further back, shedding light on a character's familial or class legacy. And characters in these films have Byzantine family histories, and the context of those histories bear down on these films, often literally materializing in scenes. So yeah, if you can't tell, it's just a whole lot. And it should almost go without saying that with films as intertextual as this, there's going to be so many references that I am missing. And so I don't want to claim any kind of definitive take on this. I mean, I'm really just a kind of weeaboo who's read a little about Japanese culture in context to the anime media that I like, you know? Most of my knowledge about Imperial Japan genuinely comes from how it relates to Zeon in Gundam, so I'm not an expert by any means. I didn't find any of these movies without merit, and one of them I find pretty transcendent, but they can also be punishing and even just plain irritating works. I would say they're best viewed with the context of his earlier films, so unless all this sounds like something you're already predisposed to love, I wouldn't start with any of these movies. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about late period Obayashi.
Casting Flower Blossoms to the Sky.
Oh boy, I hope you're ready to cry. This movie is pretty amazing. It's pretty impressive that a dense film essay about the connection between fireworks and bombs and the horrors of World War II is also a strong character piece about processing failed relationships and romantic regrets. It's a pretty exhausting movie at times, not gonna lie. Every scene is about 3 things at once, and the camera placement will move from eyeline level to an overhead shot to the ground, making you feel like you're constantly teleporting around the scene. But it's worth the investment. This is both intellectually and emotionally satisfying. Would recommend.
7 weeks.
Oh boy, hope you like shots that look like old PC adventure games and a lot of dialogue. This one sadly lost me. I'm not totally sure why it didn't work in the same way Blossoms did, because in theory they are similar movies. I think part of it though is that this is largely about this Byzantine family and its many secrets and stories, and I won't lie, I found it impossible to keep track of what was going on. There's some striking images in here in their own way, but I don't know, this movie felt like it really pummeled my attention into submission. Pretty draining experience all around. Maybe that was the point.
Hanakatami.
This one was really good, but again, as only a medium smart weeaboo, I sometimes felt like I was missing some vital cultural knowledge. It was originally expected to be Obayashi's last film. He directed it while suffering from cancer and being told he only had a few months to live. It's a meditation on decay during the Imperial era that kind of parallels this vampiric, deathly Japanese family with the Japanese nation state, which is being poisoned within by a kind of neurotic nationalist further. Or at least, I don't know, that's what I took from it. Labyrinth
of Cinema.
Okay, and his final film, Labyrinth of Cinema. This one is wild and very good. It also might be the most complex of these movies, which is saying a lot because all these movies are very complex. It's about a bunch of characters who get transported into sort of the world of cinema and then find themselves sort of trying to prevent some of the horrors of World War II, but it also keeps cutting back to Obayashi himself, and this movie is clearly kind of his requiem for both his body of work, cinema as a whole, and his final statement on the art form. And again, he was directing this very much while being incredibly ill. It's pretty much a miracle this film came out, was completed. If you watch this like I did, after having seen basically everything you could by him beforehand, then the final shot, or one of the final shots of Obayashi playing the piano, pretty much impossible to see that and not burst into tears, as I did. This is a really amazing piece of work, a really amazing final statement. However, I would probably recommend leaving it as one of the last things by him you see. So there's one more movie I want to talk about. This one is actually from pretty early in his career, 1979. It's his fourth film overall, but it embodies so much of what I love and what I got out of these films that it seemed fitting to leave it till the end.
The Adventures of Kosuke Kindaichi.
So this is easily my favourite of his filmography. I think it's a complete masterpiece, unlike basically any other film I've seen before. I was blown away. A little context before I get into it though. This movie is an adaptation of the Kosuke Kindaichi character, a Japanese pulp detective created by Seishi Yokomizo, who was extremely popular at the time. He had appeared in 5 films from the director Kon Ichikawa, a TV series, and his books have sold over 55 million copies. And this movie uses the same actor for Kindaichi as in the popular TV series from the time. But just to say, I have no familiarity of Kindaichi as a character. I had never heard of him before this movie. And I'm sure there's a lot of references here I'm not getting, but that didn't matter at all. I completely loved this. And I think I got the dynamic just fine. Kosuke is a brilliant detective who's also kind of a dumbass layabout, which provides a counterpoint to the more dependable, working class Lieutenant Todoroki. The vibe between them is sort of like if Zenigata and Lupin were on the same team. This isn't a standard adaptation though. For one, I get the impression that most Kindaichi stories take place in a fairly realistic 1930s Japan. Not the case here. The setting is like a mix between 70s hippie excess and elements of the 30s. And it's really a cartoon world with roller skating art thief gangs and these elaborate matte paintings of Tokyo. I think the 70s was such a perfect period for Obayashi's style. I'm usually kind of allergic to like hippie aesthetics, but he actually makes it seem appealing and liberating even to me. And I think that matches the playful tone of this movie. It has so many crazy visual ideas from scene to scene. I'd argue it's even more packed with inventiveness than Hausu. I mean, how did they even come up with this stuff? Like, what were they... Oh, right. Yeah, that was it. So here's the other big element in this movie that took me by surprise. So, like, I'm sure there's a lot of references here to Kindaichi books I'm not getting, but that's okay because there's actually references to all sorts of pop culture in this. Early on, for instance, we see Dracula. There's also this scene where Kindaichi goes to this museum and there's a statue of Godzilla. And hey, that's Phoenix, from the Osamu Tezuka manga Phoenix. And then multiple times in the movie, Superman appears. Like literally, real ass Superman is just in this movie with the ass and everything. At first, I thought this was just Obayashi being cute, but by the end, I realized it was pretty integral to what this thing is doing. At the end of the movie, there's this really beautiful speech about the nature of fiction. I think what we're meant to realize as this movie goes on is that this kind of takes place in a world where all the major fictional works of the 20th century exist in reality simultaneously. I read a great review of this movie on Letterboxd, which compared it to the final Ava film. And yeah, it has that metatextual kind of breaking down the walls of fiction vibe. At the end, we actually see the author of the books being given a suitcase of money, and he then turns to the screen and tells us he never wanted to be in the film. And in the climax of the movie is this surprisingly emotional monologue where Kindaichi faces the audience and criticizes the entire detective genre. You really have to see this to believe it. It's an amazing ending. The way I would describe this movie, it's like an explosion of creativity, like this heat death of pop culture overload. In fact, I would almost describe this film as like a Ragnarok for Japanese genre media, the end of the form looking back on itself wistfully. I think it's a masterpiece of pop art. It should be required viewing if you have any interest in Japanese media from this time. Unfortunately, the only copy I could find is pretty bad quality, as I'm sure you can see. Still, I just can't recommend this enough. It embodies all the reasons I think you should check out this guy's movies. The creativity, the compelling images, combined with an emotional sincerity and a raw connection to the viewer. Most people who know Obayashi know him from Hausu, and I think the appeal of that movie comes from it being such a contained experience of expressive techniques and visual styles. What I personally get from Hausu and Kindaichi, all these movies in some form, is an infectious passion for creating. A style that doesn't try to hide the artifice inherent in crafting art, but instead points it out, opens up the hood and says, "Hey, isn't this cool? We made this. Do you want to make something too?"